Douglas Macgregor asserts that from the outset, Putin and his advisors displayed no desire for conflict with NATO or the United States. This explains the gradual cautious advancement of defensive operations followed by sustained offensive actions with over 300,000 combat troops held in reserve in Russia. Macgregor suggests Putin is anticipating potential Western intervention in Western Ukraine. He believes Putin's readiness indicates a grim outlook for NATO and the US, as they are ill-prepared for confrontation with Russia. He appears to be confused, which is not uncommon for President Biden. There's a peculiar historical perspective among those in Washington. It's notable that during Eisenhower's presidency, he advocated for the neutrality of Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other regions without making commitments regarding Eastern Europe. There's no explicit obligation in the NATO treaty concerning Ukraine. If there's any obligation, it's a moral one, namely to end the conflict in Ukraine. However, he seems oblivious to the fact that the war has been lost for months. The Russian forces continue to advance towards the river, likely intending to cross and target cities like Odessa and Kiev. The idea that we could have prevented this earlier with a settlement back in March or April persists. Instead, actions have prolonged and exacerbated the situation. Zelensky is portrayed as the instigator of war, death and destruction for Ukraine. It's asserted that he lacks true Ukrainian identity, having grown up in eastern Ukraine as a Russian speaker and being heavily influenced by Russian culture. He's depicted as a puppet of oligarchs like Kai and supported by figures like Nuand. Moreover, the narrative shifts to the precarious position of globalist elites in Western and Eastern Europe. Macron and Schulz are portrayed as weak leaders, with Schulz distancing himself from Macron's policies. The suggestion is made that these elites are facing imminent removal from power and are resorting to portraying external threats to maintain their positions. The military capability of European nations, including France, is questioned with skepticism about their ability to intervene effectively in Ukraine. It's asserted that any suggestion otherwise is baseless, emphasizing that the West is not prepared for a conflict with a major power. Overall, the rhetoric is deemed as hollow, serving only to prop up failing leadership. The only thing worse than provoking an unnecessary war is attempting to bluff your way through one, and that's precisely what everyone in the West seems preoccupied with. We find ourselves lacking in ammunition, equipment, and adequately trained troops. There's a palpable reluctance to engage in conflict. Gradually, the populations in Europe are awakening to the reality that Russia doesn't pose a significant threat to them. Therefore, all of this is essentially an illusion. Regarding Odessa, it was evident early on in this crisis that Russia would target regions historically linked to Russian culture and inhabited by Russian speakers. Odessa historically was not part of Ukraine, nor was Crimea. The eastern regions, including the Donbas Basin, predominantly consisted of Russian speakers and people of Russian descent. The assertions about reclaiming cities like Kharkiv align with Russia's historical ambitions. Any attempt to hinder the Russian advance, whether from Moldova, Romania or Poland, risks triggering a war with Russia. The Russian leadership has made it abundantly clear that they will not tolerate NATO presence in Western Ukraine. In anticipation of potential escalation, Moscow has already directed its general staff to consider mobilizing an additional 800,000 troops for a broader conflict if necessary. It's important to note that Russia isn't seeking prolonged conflict. Putin has been striving to end the hostilities since their inception. However, acknowledging this reality becomes challenging when faced with the prospect of defeat. When in a losing position, there's a tendency to use media and governmental control to sway public opinion away from recognizing the dire situation. In truth, the Norwegians were better prepared in 1940 for the German attack than they are today for potential Russian actions, which would be far more formidable. It's tragic to witness individuals, particularly young women in uniform, adopting a facade of combat readiness if the reality is that they would face unimaginable horrors on the battlefield. It's time for people, especially in Norway, to awaken and recognize the situation for what it is. The key to avoiding conflict with Russia lies in reaching agreements with them in Eastern Europe and ceasing to threaten them. Instead, such actions only serve to inflate Russia's perception of the threat they face, worsening tensions. Similar concerns exist in Finland and Sweden, where discussions of positioning NATO forces near the Arctic Circle with missiles capable of threatening Russia are underway. This approach is sheer folly and only exacerbates the situation. The situation confronting Russia, whether in western Ukraine or northern Norway, would only play into their hands. It's difficult to imagine a more foolish course of action. In such a scenario, we would be left with the unfortunate choice of admitting defeat and withdrawing ignominiously or resorting to nuclear weapons due to our lack of ground strength. It's essential to remember the principles behind the concept of flexible response established in 1969. Back then, the goal was to possess enough conventional military power to deter Soviet aggression effectively, ensuring any attack would fail. This approach contrasts starkly with the current strategy of threatening Russia with a series of attacks, which is not conducive to peace, but rather paves the way for war. He recounts an incident from a 2019 dinner at the National Interest, where he engaged with a neoconservative from the Atlantic Council who dismissed the notion of war with Russia over eastern Ukraine as ridiculous. However, he argues that such dismissals are misguided, and that Moscow's warnings should be taken seriously. The potential consequences of involvement in western Ukraine leading to a war with Russia, possibly escalating to the global nuclear level, are emphasized. He suggests that the influence of individuals like John Bolton, who have advocated for war with Iran, persists due to their vested interests and lobbying efforts. He asserts that promoting wider war in the region undermines the pursuit of peace and stability. He predicts potential actions following Ramadan, expressing regret at the unnecessary escalation and urging for measures to prevent it. Ms. Naya's only viable option now appears to be escalation by bringing Israel into a confrontation with Iran. They are primarily focused on Arab nations, Palestine and Gaza. While they are contemplating possibilities with Hezbollah, they are likely to engage in Lebanon and confront Hezbollah. They believe they have control of the situation, viewing the United States as their compliant ally ready to provide unconditional support, particularly in terms of air and naval power. With this steadfast support from Washington and London, Netanyahu is expected to escalate further after Ramadan. The region is anticipated to undergo significant upheaval, possibly leading to a regional war that would be challenging to halt. There is an opportunity presently to intervene and insist on a different approach, but it's unlikely to materialize. Reflecting on past events such as Trump's failed agreement with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, which aimed to denuclearize the Korean peninsula, it's evident that efforts towards peace have been undermined by individuals like Bolton and Pompeo, who are committed to confrontation. Despite initial support for the agreement, Trump ultimately backed away, missing an opportunity to advance towards peace. This is regrettable, especially considering the potential support from Beijing, which has its concerns about North Korea's destabilizing influence in the region. The historical sponsor for North Korea has been Moscow. Russia has consistently provided aid, equipment, and technology to North Korea, especially as tensions escalated over the Ukraine conflict. Moscow saw it as necessary to bolster North Korea's capabilities to counterbalance Western actions in Europe. However, this pattern of escalation needs to be halted. Instead, we are sending signals to North Korea that they are facing increased danger with a willingness to use any means to attack them. Additionally, the deployment of military advisors on islands like Claymore and Matsu, closer to the Chinese mainland than Taiwan, indicates a broader escalation along the Eurasian periphery. This approach of intimidation and coercion has been utilized for decades with varying degrees of success. However, it has not proven effective in Vietnam or the Middle East, and it's likely to fail in Korea as well. There's a risk that continued escalation could prompt South Korea to push for the removal of US presence from the peninsula, with potential support from China and even Japan. However, regardless of the response from regional actors, the fundamental issue remains: escalating tensions without adequate preparedness for conflict is counterproductive. It's not about appeasement, but rather recognizing the need for readiness and strength before engaging in warfare. Currently, the US finds itself in no position to enter into a successful conflict, given societal disarray, economic challenges, and fiscal instability resulting from excessive spending. Therefore, war should only be considered when there's a realistic chance of victory, which is not the case in current circumstances. Since the mid to late 1990s, there has been a clear need for a regular army of about 600,000 to sustain the global operations to which the United States has committed. However, there's been an unwillingness to acknowledge this reality. Instead, there's been a tendency to offer fancy equipment and promises of modernization as compensation for shrinking manpower. This row has led to a deterioration of the force's core strength, exacerbated by inadequate structure and lack of depth in fighting power logistics and sustainment. Attempting to deploy to regions like the Middle East or Eastern Europe with such deficiencies would likely result in operational failure within a short span. The fundamental strength observed in the early 1990s is no longer present, while advocating for a draft isn't on the agenda. Maintaining a better and larger army seems logical. However, resources are being diverted from the army to other endeavors, discouraging talented individuals from joining and bleeding the force of experienced personnel. Moreover, there's a concerning trend of personnel leaving the armed forces as soon as possible due to dissatisfaction and overstretch. Some are even being involuntarily retained due to shortages. This situation not only affects morale, but also undermines the overall force structure, which is in dire need of overhaul. The lack of concern from senior ranks about these issues is disheartening. It's essential to recognize the value of human capital within the military and address these pressing challenges accordingly. In both the private sector and the military, nothing seems to be functioning as it should. The problem stems from the top levels of the United States government and NATO, where promises are made without the ability to fulfill them. This is dangerous, especially because the Russians are not bluffing. They possess real capabilities and confidence. It was somewhat relieving to hear the Chief of Staff of the Army publicly acknowledge this fact, as he's been the only one to do so. The reality is, we don't want to engage in a conflict with Russia, and thankfully they don't want that either. Yet everything we're currently doing seems to be leading us toward our own destruction, pushing us into an untenable position from which recovery seems impossible. This raises concerns about the possibility of resorting to nuclear weapons, a scenario we desperately want to avoid. Our current approach lacks the flexibility and intelligence of response needed to navigate these challenges effectively. This course of action must change. The American people, although not directly consulted, are certainly aware that they do not want this path. They desire a secure border, an end to illegal immigration, and an end to domestic criminality. They are also concerned about the influx of millions of people into the country who cannot be employed. Have you ever pondered how the choices we make today, informed by our preparation and foresight, could shape the course of our future? How the echoes of history can offer us invaluable insights? Let us delve into this fascinating topic. Our journey begins in the year 1914, with the British Expeditionary Force setting foot on the battlegrounds of World War I. Despite being a competent force, it was small and ill-prepared. The lack of adequate preparation and resources led to the sacrifice of the force in the midst of conflict. This event serves as a stark reminder, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate preparation and the risks of engaging in conflicts without the necessary resources and foresight. In those days, the British could rely on substantial military support from their French allies. Fast forward to today, we find ourselves in a world where such dependable allies with significant military capabilities are lacking. The once formidable German army and air force are no longer what they used to be, and rebuilding them overnight is an impossibility. This leaves us in a position where the sensible approach is to halt the fighting, secure the best possible deal for Ukraine, and assist in their recovery. However, our current reality is far from this ideal. Instead of aiding Ukraine, there are interests eager to exploit and strip it for their own gain. This exploitation sees no resistance from Europe or concern from Washington, which itself benefits from such actions. We find ourselves in an upside-down world where criminals are treated leniently, and illegal immigrants are portrayed as virtuous contributors to the nation's progress. This absurd notion echoes the lead up to the Spanish Civil War, where the Republican left, dominated by communists, attacked Spanish heritage and values. Our government's policies seem to be systematically anti-American, contributing to a disconcerting environment. However, we collaborate with like-minded organizations aiming to address our shared challenges peacefully, ideally through democratic means. While some may lose hope in these avenues, We remain committed to them and hope others will join us in pursuing solutions through dialogue and democratic processes. In summary, history teaches us the importance of preparation and foresight. The fate of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 reminds us of the dangers of inadequate preparation. Our current global situation emphasizes the need for strong allies and the importance of supporting nations in need rather than exploiting them for our gain. And finally, our commitment to peaceful dialogue and democratic processes underlines our hope for a more harmonious future. So, as we move forward, let us do so with the lessons of history in mind and strive to create a better world for us all.